Humans evolved to trust what costs energy and risk, not what is easy to produce. Language is not the message. It is the shadow the message casts in the human mind. Action is the message, because action is costly, it's embodied, and it's irreversible. Language proposes intent. Action confirms or falsifies intent. This is not poetic intuition. It is a deeply accurate behavioral model that aligns with neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, linguistics, and intelligence analysis. This is a behavioral and neurocognitive model of communication. Human communication is often modeled as a linguistic exchange. However, empirical evidence from neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and behavioral psychology demonstrates that action, not language, functions as the primary carrier of meaning. This formalizes the principle that language is a shadow signal. It's a low-cost projection of intent, while action constitutes the true message due to its cost, its irreversibility, and its predictive power. This is my action language coherence model, or ALCM, and it explains trust formation, trust collapse, fear generation, and conversational termination. By using intent inference mechanisms and prediction error dynamics, I can show why actions override language when there are discrepancies. Traditional linguistic models emphasize syntax, semantics, and pragmatics as the foundations of communication. These models insufficiently account for a fundamental human constraint, though. Communication is evolutionary bound to survival, and survival depends on the accurate inference of intent, because spoken language is low cost and it's easily manipulated. Human cognition evolved to prioritize behavior evidence over verbal claims. So this reframes conversation as a behaviorally grounded process, where language proposes intent and action validates or falsifies it. In evolutionary signaling theory, signal reliability correlates with cost. So high-cost signals, which would be those requiring energy, risk, or sacrifice, are resistant to deception, while low-cost signals are not. Spoken language is energetically inexpensive and reversible. Action is energetically expensive and consequential. Therefore, action is inherently more trustworthy than language. There is a natural intent inference in human cognition. Humans possess specialized neural systems for inferring intent, and this would include the amygdala, which is our threat detection, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is social prediction, and our mirror neuron system, which is action understanding. These systems have evolved to prioritize observed behavior over verbal description, because behavior more accurately predicts future risk or cooperation. I define language as a shadow signal. By doing this, the definition of language becomes a symbolic projection of intended action that exists only as a hypothesis in the receiver's cognitive model. So language does not constitute commitment. It merely casts a predictive shadow of possible future behavior. Under this definition, properties of shadow signals would be low energetic cost, easily falsified, high susceptibility to deception, and the meaning is contingent on subsequent action. So without behavioral confirmation, language remains informationally incomplete. This makes action as the primary message, action as a high-cost signal. Actions require bodily execution. They require time and exposure to consequences. Because actions cannot be retroactively denied, they also serve as irreversible data for intent inference. With this, there also becomes a predictive supremacy of action. So when language and action conflict, the brain resolves ambiguity by weighing action more heavily. This is a rational bias in response. Actions carry higher likelihood of representing true intent. My action language coherence model, or ACLM, proposes that trust in conversation depends on coherence between linguistic signals and behavioral outputs. The states of the model are simple. 1. Coherence. Language accurately predicts action, and trust stabilizes. 2. Ambiguity. Incomplete action, and trust remains provisional. And number 3, violation. If action contradicts language, then trust collapses. When actions violate linguistic predictions, the neural prediction error increases sharply, and this triggers threat classification, withdrawal of social engagement, and termination of conversational processing. This leads to behavioral consequences of incoherence, and one would be fear and uncertainty. Fear arises not solely from harm, but from unpredictability. Incoherent people generate elevated uncertainty, which the nervous system interprets as danger. And 2, loss of intent legibility. So once coherence is broken, the person's intentions become unreadable, and at this stage, language is reclassified as manipulative noise rather than meaningful input. For example, if a subject requests directions from a stranger, and the stranger verbally agrees to help, signaling cooperation, and then kicks you in the knee. The stranger then commits an act of physical aggression, and this action instantaneously overrides all prior linguistic content. So, in other words, the brain updates the intent model from cooperative to hostile, terminating any conversation. This would demonstrate that action dominates meaning assignment, regardless of prior verbal assurance. I define conversation as action-language integration. So, the redefinition of conversation as a dynamic system integrating speech, behavior, and trust calibration. The reason I define conversation as a action-language integration is because language alone is insufficient. Conversation requires behavioral consistency to remain viable. This redefines the conditions for conversational power as well. So language exerts power only when it consistently predicts action, only when it reduces uncertainty, and only when it aligns with observed behavior over time. And the implications of this would be a better trust assessment. Trust should be assessed primarily through behavioral consistency rather than verbal reassurance. Better deception detection. Discrepancies between language and action serve as the most reliable indicators of deception. And better ethical and legal relevance. Claims of intent carry limited weight without corroborating action. This is reinforcing the primacy of behavior in responsibility attribution. This model establishes that action is the dominant carrier of meaning in human communication, while language still functions as a secondary, shadow-based predictor. When action and language diverge, the human cognitive system rationally prioritizes action, resulting in trust collapse and conversational termination. Meaningful communication, therefore, requires sustained action, language, coherence. Where coherence falls, language loses semantic authority. The core principle is language proposes intent, action proves it. When proof fails, meaning collapses. And then there's my neurobehavioral model of action-language incoherence. Now that we've observed how trust loss and conversational breakdown occur when observed actions contradict linguistic signals, producing heightened prediction error and threat responses in the human nervous system. Such breakdowns are not attributed to emotional weakness. It represents adaptive protective mechanisms that are rooted in intent, inference, and survival-oriented cognition. So now I'll present a scientific model explaining how trust and conversation can be recovered following action, language, incoherence. by focusing on corrective action, not verbal reassurance. I propose the action-based trust recovery model, detailing the neural, behavioral, and temporal conditions under which the brain reclassifies a previously unsafe agent as conditionally safe, allowing conversation to resume and trust to be rebuilt. We've established that human communication depends on the accurate inference of intent. So when language and action diverge, the brain prioritizes the action, triggering fear, uncertainty, and withdrawal from conversational engagement. This response is functional, it's not pathological. However, human societies also require mechanisms for trust repair. So this model addresses how trust may be reestablished only through corrective, observable behavior, and why language alone is insufficient to reverse trust collapse. If you define trust loss as an adaptive neural response, then there's a prediction error and threat activation. So trust loss arises when actions violate linguistic predictions, producing a sharp increase in neural prediction error. This activates amygdala-mediated threat processing. It activates stress response pathways, which is a sympathetic activation, and it activates inhibition of social cognition circuits. So the resulting fear response reflects uncertainty about intent, not emotional fragility. This leads to conversational shutdown. Once trust collapses, the language from the offending party is deprioritized. Speech is processed as potential manipulation rather than information, and conversation becomes neurologically unsafe until new evidence alters the intent model. There are reasons why language cannot repair trust. One is a verbal reassurance is a low-cost signal. After a violation, verbal apologies or assurances remain low cost and therefore unreliable. From a Bayesian perspective, additional language without corrective action increases suspicion rather than trust. Another reason is the inversion effect. Following betrayal, the brain may invert linguistic meaning, interpreting reassurance as increased threat due to historical incongruence. This is the action-based trust recovery model. The core principle is that trust is not restored by explanation, but by consistent, voluntary, and non-coercive corrective action that reduces uncertainty over time. Under this model, there are necessary conditions for trust reentry. Behavioral conditions must be met to allow the nervous system to exit threat mode. These conditions would be cessation of harmful action. So the violating behavior must fully stop, verifiably and without exception. There has to be transparency through behavior. So actions must be observable and independently verifiable, not privately claimed. Costly correction. Corrective actions must impose real cost, effort, inconvenience, accountability on the violator, signaling sincerity. Non-urgency. The injured party must not be pressured to forgive, engage, or converse. And temporal consistency. New behavior must persist across time. Trust recovery is a slow learning process. There are neural mechanisms of trust rebuilding. One is gradual prediction updating. Repeated observation of coherent action reduces prediction error incrementally. The prefrontal cortex begins to reclassify intent from unknown threat to low risk, and the amygdala response diminishes correspondingly. The second mechanism of trust rebuilding would be conditional safety encoding. Trust does not return fully or instantly, so the brain initially encodes conditional safety, allowing limited interaction while maintaining monitoring. Boundaries do play a role in recovery. Clear boundaries function as stabilizing constraints, reducing uncertainty. Respecting boundaries is itself a powerful corrective action. That means there is also boundary violations as a reset. So any breach during recovery resets the trust repair process, reinforcing, again, the threat classification. When it comes to resumption of conversation, conversation resumes only after trust repair begins. It cannot precede it. Language regains meaning only once actions reliably predict non-harm. And the re-legitimization of language has to take place first. As action-language coherence stabilizes, linguistic signals are re-weighted as informative rather than deceptive. Which takes us to distinguishing forgiveness from trust. Forgiveness is an internal process. Trust is an external, evidence-based assessment. This model concerns trust, not forgiveness. One may forgive without restoring conversational access. And this would imply interpersonal repair. Effective trust repair requires behavior change, not emotional appeals. Legal and/or ethical accountability. Corrective action carries greater rehabilitative value than verbal remorse. And intelligence and security context. People are reclassified based on observed behavior over time, not stated intent mirroring intelligence tradecraft. Trust lost and conversational breakdown are adaptive responses to action, language, and coherence. Recovery requires a reversal of uncertainty through consistent, costly, and non-coercive corrective actions. Only when behavior reliably predicts safety does the brain permit fear reduction and conversational re-engagement. Language regains meaning only after action has restored coherence. The core principle of this model is that trust is rebuilt the same way it is formed, through what is done repeatedly, not what is said once. This is grounded in neuroscience and behavior, not emotion, weakness, or forgiveness narratives.